I'm Ralph Preston. William Lowe and I are back for yet another roadmap. And tonight we've got an interesting subject that's important to almost all stroke survivors with any kind of gait issues. And that is, we're going to talk a little bit about the hip and hip strength. And hip strength is critical to getting back something that resembles your gait pre-stroke. So I know, William, you've got some thoughts about this, as do I. It's been an issue for me, ongoing issue for me throughout my recovery. So I definitely have something to add, but you were going to go ahead and start us off. So why don't you do that?
Yeah, sure thing. So when it comes to recovery after stroke, I think training your hips or your hip muscles, I think it's quite underrated in recovery after stroke. It doesn't get a lot of attention, but I think it plays a really crucial role, especially if you're a stroke survivor who's really serious about getting back your walking after stroke. And of course, if you're a stroke survivor who's trying to get your rhythm back when it comes to returning to walking after stroke. And the reason why I say this is because when it comes to your hips and recovering the ability to use your hips in your recovery after stroke, the hips are crucial because they actually allow your brain to learn how to actually clear the ground safely whenever you walk in your recovery after stroke. A lot of times in recovery after stroke, some stroke survivors, or the majority of stroke survivors, they have trouble clearing the ground, which is why sometimes whenever they're walking, they have this thing which Ralph calls hip dip, where when they lift up one leg, then their affected hip wants to dip over to one side, and they're almost swaying from one side to the other as they walk. And sometimes when they do walk, and when they're trying to lift up the affected hip, they almost have to use their unaffected leg as an anchor to mentally prep themselves to lift up the affected hip over an object. And obviously, when they do this, you can see that they're compensating and using their entire lower trunk, to actually get the affected leg over an object. And if you're a stroke survivor who's really serious about your recovery and you're not a fan of doing this for the rest of your life, it's really important. It's really important to pay some attention to your hips when it comes to walking after stroke if you really want to get as much back as possible and recover as much of your walking ability before you had your stroke, after your stroke, so that you can recover as much as possible in your journey after stroke. So I think hips, the way to strengthen up the hips the most in recovery after stroke are actually by doing exercises where you're actually forcing your brain to actually lift up that hip a lot more. So one of the exercises which is really important, especially in the acute phase of stroke, which is the first month or the first 3-4 months of stroke, to really get those signals going is just simply marching on the spot. And the reason why marching on the spot, whether this is seated or standing up, is really good is because when you're marching, what you're doing is you're actually training your brain to learn how to distribute weight across both legs equally, so that you're able to mimic something which would usually happen when you're walking in an upright position. So when you're lifting up one leg, following by the other, the leg which is staying still and isn't being lifted is the one which bears most of the weight of your body, and vice versa. And I think that marching is a good stepping stone, no pun intended, to your recovery, because it can really strengthen a lot of those muscles that you use to lift up your hip and allow you to clear the ground, and not only clear your ground, but also allow you to actually lift up your leg and also keep your knee extended at the same time, so that you can strike the ground with your heel at the same time. And the way that this happens is by teaching your brain to turn on this muscle at the front of your knee, which is called your rectus femoris, which is basically a muscle which you use to lift up your hip and also extend the knee at the same time. So I think in general, doing putting a focus on the hips when it comes to recovery after stroke, it's really crucial, because if you miss this, then it's likely that for the rest of your life, you'll be walking as if you're swaying from one side to the other, or as other stroke survivors have described, as they feel like they're walking as if they're drunk, or you might even have to rely on something external to help you walk, such as an AFO, which obviously is quite hard, which is obviously quite difficult to manage, and it actually can be counterproductive, because it teaches your brain to rely on an external object to help you actually get the walking done, rather than actually training itself on how to strengthen up the muscles which are required to actually allow you to walk a lot better in your recovery after stroke. So that's where I want to start with hips when it comes to walking after stroke, and why it's so important to recovery after stroke. Now, Ralph, earlier we were talking about hips, and you mentioned that you had some experience about training the hips in your recovery after stroke, and how important these were when it comes to walking. So I just wanted to pass it back to you, and I just want to hear if you had any thoughts that you want to share with all the folks watching.
Sure, I got bunches. I noticed fairly early on in my recovery that I had what I call hip dip, and unfortunately, I listened to an outpatient physical therapist who said go for distance and not for form. So I didn't focus on form until I realized that he was wrong, and form was more important. I got some direction from rehab hospital I was in, and I called it. I would say I would try and practice some walking tall on my affected hip, which would mean like kind of keeping your hips at the same level and lifting that affected leg up and up. I didn't know anything much about a couple of things that I do now that would have been very useful, and I'll pass them on to our viewers because they might be in the early stages of recovery. Okay, in marching, absolutely. I did tons of marching, and I did tons of walking. I did tons of squats or knee bends. In fact, I would say that if you only did two exercises, that marching and squats or knee bends are definitely two that you should do. They're real good for strengthening the upper leg, but they're basically strengthening the quads and the hamstrings, and they don't do much for the glutes, and they don't do all that much for the hip flexors. Walking does, and marching probably does a bit. So I did thousands and thousands of those and walked, and I continued to have a bit of hip dip. As I built up that upper leg, it got better, but it never got it never got like what I thought was right. I could walk in front of people and they would say, well, I don't see anything wrong, but it felt wrong to me. And if they really knew what to look for or paid attention, they probably could have seen it. Or maybe they were just being kind. Anyway, so I went a number of years where I had a slight limp or whatever you want to call it. Slight amount of hip dip. I could walk 3, 4, 5 miles. So it wasn't a matter of endurance. I just never got the form perfect, and I still haven't. I'm probably closer than I was at 6 months or even 6 years. What are the things that I learned since then? Well, I learned about core. I learned about transverse abdominal muscles, a band that runs basically across your waist. I learned about hip flexors. I learned about hip abduction, and there are a number, and also things like bridges. I mentioned I started to say core, and I mentioned transverse abdominal muscles. But core is key to everything, and it's a key to walking. And I think it's got something to do with having a strong hip that you can walk tall on it. So nobody told me about core in the beginning. I got, different therapists gave me different exercises. Almost none of them were core. Wasn't until I started helping other people and looking around and talking to other stroke survivors that I realized other therapists and other people were doing core. And as I talked to the more successful stroke survivors, by successful I mean who had a fairly successful recovery, the core came up a lot. So no matter where you are in your recovery, you should be doing some kind of core work. That way I could say that in any and every roadmap we ever had or ever will have. But I think it's important to hips. So what kinds of things have I learned, since 6 or 8 years or 10 years out that have helped with strengthening the hip? Well, there were a couple. So while we're on core, we'll stick with core. Bridges work good. One way you can work your hip flexor muscles, you can isolate them, is to lay on your back on the ground with your affected leg, the knee bent, your unaffected leg out straight, and bridge like that. And if you bridge like that, you're basically, because your other unaffected leg is out straight, it's kind of like a one-legged bridge. I also do one-legged bridges, but I hold my and I do them on my affected side, both sides. But on the affected side, you hold your unaffected leg out straight or do whatever you want with it. In this case, you got it on the ground, so it's kind of blocked, isolated, neutralized, and that'll force you to use the hip flexors as a part of doing bridges. And you also need to learn to strengthen those hip flexors with your knee bent, because part of the whole walking pattern where you don't walk tall is the part where you do your heel strike, your plantar flexion and push through, which is all with your knee bent before you transfer the weight back to your unaffected side. So having that knee bent is good. What else did I learn? You can do hip abduction by just sending your affected leg straight out at the counter. You can also sit somewhere where your feet are off the ground and spread both your legs at the same time. Those will both work your hips. But the real game changers for me was when I learned that basically my glutes weren't firing. I'd heard this from a number of people, but I went to a physical therapist and he basically said, well, like 99% of everybody, your glutes aren't firing very well. They don't fire very well before a stroke, and after stroke, they're a big issue. I'd heard this from other stroke survivors, but it's always good to hear it from a doctor of physical therapy, because that, to me, that kind of confirms what the stroke survivors were saying. So he gave me a couple of exercises to build up my glutes that did make a difference. And I went to him because I'm 15 years out, it was 2 years ago. So about 12, 13 years, I started getting some pain in my hip at night, particularly when I was tired. And I think that was due to the fact that all the muscles around my hip were not as strong as they should be. So what are the 2 exercises he gave me that you might be able to utilize? And I have videos of them I can put in the description. I have videos on my YouTube channel of both of them. One is doing a sit to stand with a TheraBand while you pull out your knees. You tie the TheraBand around your knees, not tight, not loose, with your knees together, and that gives you about the right amount of tension. And what you do is you pull your knees, spread your knees wide, You do sit to stands. And when you pull those knees out, you're kind of deactivating somewhat, not completely, your quads and hamstrings, which forces your glutes to fire. Well, they were really difficult to do. You only do 3 or 4 or 5 of them in the beginning. I built up to doing about 3 sets of 20 a day. And I noticed a big difference in my walking and my hip, and the pain went away, and the pain has stayed away despite the fact I don't do 60 of them. So I've somehow trained my brain, I would say, William, to fire my glutes more on a subliminal basis, because I'm not doing 60 of them a day like I did at that point. The other one was, this is the last thing, I'll wrap it up here. I know I've been talking a while. The other thing was sidestepping. Now, I'd done sidestepping before, and it's real good. I've done it myself. I did it in the pool. I did it with other stroke survivors on land. I did it in the pool. Even did it on land sometimes with TheraBand. Well, what was different about this one, Ralph? Well, what he showed me was sidestepping, where you keep the tension on the band. In other words, most of the time when you sidestep with a band, you sidestep out, you bring the other one up, and the band gets loose. And in this case, you sidestep out, you bring the other foot, because you go in both directions, the other foot, but you don't bring it so close that the band gets loose. You maintain tension. And maintaining that tension is a lot like spreading your knees on the sit-to stands. Maintaining that tension apparently forces you to use your glutes more than if you didn't. So those were 2 big game changers for me. I occasionally do the sit-to stands with TheraBand, but I'm not doing 60. And basically in the last 2 years, I've had, I would say, not a single day of any kind of hip pain. And I would get it at night after walking around with a little teeny bit of hip dip. Like I mentioned to you, William, people would say, but you seem to be walking okay to me, but I felt it on the inside. You can tell when you're not walking tall on that hip because it just doesn't feel strong. So those are some of my comments, or maybe most of them. We'll see. Based on what you have to say, I usually come up with something else to add. So back to you, William.
Yeah, sure. So for everyone watching, I just want to highlight what Ralph said about how you might notice that you're not walking. You might notice that you whenever he was walking, that he noticed that it wasn't stable, and he noticed that this was basically due to the way he walked, and obviously how much emphasis he had put on his hips. So I think it's really important on that note to really work on the hips in your recovery after stroke, because it really helps address pelvic stability in your walking. So pelvic stability is actually really important when it comes to recovery after stroke, because when you're recovering your ability to walk after stroke, you have different muscles which are going to be a lot stronger than others. For example, your brain might have learned how to recruit the big, bulky muscles used for walking a lot quicker compared to the other muscles which are used to extend your knee and also assist your ability to walk in smaller ways. So I think when it comes to recovery after stroke, pelvic stability in particular is the thing which is going to give your body that sense that you're actually walking quite well with quite a good rhythm, and you're putting equal amounts of weight on each leg. And I think when it comes to working out your hips or strengthening up muscles which are involved with lifting up your leg up, it's really important to address this because it can actually help stabilize your pelvis. And when your pelvis is a lot more stable, this can allow you to actually improve your ability to balance in your recovery after stroke. And obviously with improved balance, it allows you to actually walk a lot better, because when you're walking, each leg takes on the weight of your body before it transitions that weight over to the other leg. And obviously, if you can balance on one leg quite well, then you can transition that weight over to the other leg. And quite often, with instances where a lot of stroke survivors have hip dip, or they notice that they're mentally prepping themselves to lift up the affected leg by stabilizing themselves on their non-affected leg, it's because their pelvic stability is not at a level where the muscles on their affected hip or their affected leg are strong enough to support the weight of their body so that they can seamlessly transition over to their non-affected leg to take that second step and so on, so forth. So I think just as an add-on to what Ralph said with the exercises, one other exercise which I think doesn't get a lot of credit. I mean, it's still done quite frequently, but it can be done wrong quite easily, is just simply going upstairs or going downstairs. Because when you think about going upstairs, the first leg you lead with is always going to be the leg which is going to be taking on most of your weight. And if you try this at home, and you're a stroke survivor who's watching this right now, so maybe you can try this at home right after you finish watching this roadmap. If you try stepping up a step with your affected leg first, and you lean towards the direction of your affected leg. So, for example, if your left side affected, and you lean towards your left side as you go up, you might notice that your hip is going to be straining quite a lot to support the weight of your body. And you might almost get to a point where you feel like your knee is going to buckle and you might almost fall over. So this is why the hip is really important, is because when you go upstairs or when you're taking that first step with your affected leg, the hip is actually going to stabilize and support the weight of your body so that the rest of your leg doesn't actually buckle, and you can actually support your weight temporarily over to that side before you actually take that second step with your non-affected leg. So when we're talking about walking, what we're talking about is, when it comes to your hip and when it comes to pelvic stability, we're talking about the part of your leg which is on the outside right here, which is used to support the weight of your body as you're leaning over to one side. So the stronger you get that part of your hip, the more likely you're able to actually walk a lot better, because your affected leg can actually stabilize the weight of your body if you shift too far over to your affected side as you're walking. And that actually prevents the swaying, which a lot of stroke survivors experience in their recovery after stroke, where they're swaying from one side to the other, or they're mentally prepping themselves again on their non-affected leg to actually lift up their affected leg to take that next step. So what I'm really trying to say here is that, just as an add-on to what Ralph said, for all of the folks watching this roadmap right now, you can see there are many perspectives that Ralph and I are sharing here when it comes to strengthening up the hips. We've shared why it's important to actually strengthen the hips, and how this can actually help pelvic stability, and how pelvic stability can actually improve your gait and also allow you to get more into a rhythm. Well, when you put all the pieces together and you give your brain all of these exercises, and you give your brain all of these reference points, whether it be the bridging, whether it be the side stepping with the TheraBand, what you're essentially doing is you are putting or exposing your brain to these conditions where it has to turn on multiple muscles surrounding your hip so that it can strengthen up your affected leg enough so that you can get to a place where you're walking a lot better and you're walking with a lot better rhythm, because your affected leg can actually stabilize the weight of your body as that weight transitions over from your non-affected leg over to your affected leg. And by doing this, it actually helps prevent that hip dip, which a lot of stroke survivors experience in their recovery after stroke, which in turn will allow you as a stroke survivor to walk a lot better. And not only that, be able to clear the ground safely whenever you take each step, so that you can actually reach your full potential and achieve your best ability to walk in your recovery after stroke.
Okay. Well, you brought up a couple things that made me think of a couple more things that hadn't mentioned. One is our old friend weight bearing is always key. If you can do weight bearing on your affected leg, that'll tell your brain you want to use that leg. It also will help build up all parts of the leg. You're talking about, being able to weight bear evenly uh, throughout your gait. One way that you can do that is through what some people call monster walking or John Wayne walking, where you take a wider stance. And my neuro PT had me doing this, and I did it for a while, and it did help. No one could ever tell me how to bring my feet back in and still maintain the whole thing. What happens? So I asked the neuro PT why she assigned that, and she wrote a little paragraph that I put with my John Wayne walking video. And she said basically that your brain is, as we know, our brain's trying to take the easiest path and trick us into, into all that. So what happens is if you walk at a normal width, your brain just is able to not transfer the weight to that side. When you widen out your gait, it's not possible for that to happen anymore. That's a kind of a crude version of the paragraph that she wrote, but I'll put all these videos in the description, and you can look at that video and read her notes on it for yourself. I don't know. I mean, I did it for months. I did it every day. I walked about 3 or 4 laps around my backyard, so I wasn't like walking miles, but I did it every day for a while. And I just didn't, I never had anybody explain to me how eventually I could bring them back in and still have that stability. So that's not real helpful, Ralph. Anyway, another thing I remembered was while I was first became aware of this walking tall and hip dip stuff, 6 months into my walking after I started concentrating on form. One day I just put my hands on my hips back here. I decided I wanted to feel what was going on, see if I could feel any difference. So I do that a lot. I touch parts of my body that aren't working right while I'm walking or while I'm doing things and just see and then compare them to the other side. So I put my hands back there to see if I could feel any difference in the way my the top of my femur, the ball in the ball and socket was acting differently or whatever. And I didn't feel all that much. But one thing I noticed was when I did that, I had much less hip dip. So I actually walked around like that. Another time, I had a similar experience. We're talking about core. My cousin is my age. He's a chiropractor and a acupuncturist in California. And he was showing me a transverse abdominal walk. Maybe it's just focused. When he did that, he walked from literally your transverse abdominals go right here at your waistline. And he actually put his hands on that part of his body, and then he walked from there. His whole pelvic floor stayed stable. His upper body stayed stable. He showed me. I kind of halfway got it. He showed me a way of. I wish I could remember more about it. Of how you could practice it walking down the hall, not leaning on, but rubbing on the sidewall. Again, gee, Ralph, that's not real helpful. But core is key. And one of the things that I have a lot of people send me videos and I look at them 99% of the time, it's upper leg weakness. So I look first, well, I kind of got a little routine. I look and see what they're doing to not lift the leg, if they're circumducting or if got foot drop, what their heel strike looks like, what their push off, what their plantar flexion and roll through to push off to the next looks like, what their upper leg strength looks like. But something I added a few years ago when I became aware of all this with the hips is one of the things I do is I just focus on their hips or their waistline. If they're got on pants, it's got a waistline, and you can watch and see if that waistline's staying steady or if one side's going, if it's doing this. If it's doing that, you can tell that they've got hip weakness, and you can tell them not only you need to work on your upper leg strength, which is about almost always one of the suggestions. But if you see that, then you also know that there's some hip weakness. Here's the thing you said earlier, William, put it all together. Well, I mean that's easier said than done, as we all know. Try to recover. The other thing is, if one of the pieces of your walking isn't working, like your hips, I notice if I just walked to the kitchen before we started this, and I'm a little tired today from gardening and doing bunches of stuff. And I notice that when my hip is weaker, let's say at the end of the day, I don't pick my foot up as much. I don't have drop foot, but I'm not picking it up as much. The point of this is that if you don't have all the pieces built up, it's really hard to put it all together. And if you have a weakness in one thing, it can affect other things. If you don't have a good push off, it's going to affect your gait seriously, because if you want to run or it's real important to do that moving forward, that plantar flexion and roll through from the heel strike. That's what moves you forward. So if like your hips that's screwed up, or your hips are screwed up, it's or not working perfectly. I shouldn't say screwed up, but if you haven't gotten back to the strength that you need to have good gait, each one of those pieces affects the other part. Because I just experienced it walking to the kitchen to fill up my smoothie, where I didn't feel like I was walking as good as when I got up this morning. And it's because I'm tired and I've got that little bit of leftover hip weakness. And so, but I've had no pain. And one thing I want to tell people is that I thought it like 6 months in, and I started getting hip pain. I thought, oh, great, I've had a stroke now, and now I've done all this crappy walking, and I'm going to need a hip replacement. Well, I did eventually got an X-ray, and they told me I didn't. And I went back 5 years later, and he told me my hip was fine. So there are a lot of people out there that think that they're ruining their hip or they're going to need a hip replacement. I did too, maybe different for you, but in my case, I felt that way. I felt like, my hip's not working right. I'm wearing out the ball and socket probably. I'm going to need a hip replacement. Be 16 years in April, and I had a X-ray a couple of years ago, and got told, well, for somebody as old as you, they didn't quite say that, you don't have as much arthritis as I might suspect. So it apparently doesn't ruin your hip, or it didn't in my case. So if you're worried about needing a hip replacement, well, go see an ortho and get a X-ray and see what's going on. But I felt that way, and I didn't need a hip replacement. And I still haven't had one, and I don't think I'll ever need one. So put that to rest. So, William, you got anything else you want to add?
I mean, the only thing I have left to add is when it comes to strengthening up your hip or anything to do with walking, for all the folks watching, this is a conscious practice, right? So after a stroke, your affected leg is always going to be a little bit weaker than your non-affected leg. Now, your non-affected leg is going to obviously take care of itself because it wasn't as impacted as much as your affected leg after your stroke recovery. So what this means is, as you're going about your day, just like I said, when you're going up the stairs, making sure that you lean towards your affected side as you go up the stairs, and making sure that you don't lean towards your non-affected side. It means that this doesn't just apply to that exercise, but everything you do. So whenever you're standing up from the toilet, whenever you're standing up from the bed, you always have to police yourself to strengthen up that hip, which means that whenever you're doing a sit to stand or a squat, when you're standing up from the squat, to make a conscious effort to lean towards the affected side as you go up. And conversely, lean towards the affected side when you come back down and when you sit down as well. This way, you're really strengthening up the hips. And as Ralph said, as the day goes along, it's likely that your brain is going to lose that ability to police that affected leg. And I also get it myself. After a long day, I find that I can't lift up my affected leg as well as in the morning. And I bet a lot of stroke survivors who are watching this actually resonate with that. So I think if you can get into a habit of really policing yourself to pay more attention to that affected leg, and whether this be leaning towards the affected side whenever you're standing up or whenever you're going upstairs, then it's likely that you'll get to a place where your brain has just naturally done this so often that it becomes second nature to do this, and it almost feels a little bit awkward or weird to not pay attention to that affected side or strengthen up that hip whenever you're walking. And I think for all the folks watching who have been following along with this roadmap, you can see that Raf and I, we've shared a lot of different exercises and a lot of perspectives that you can give your brain to really build that blueprint up on how to actually strengthen up your walking and strengthen up your hip when it comes to your recovery after stroke. And I think when you do all of these things in combination and you add on the conscious practice and just constantly reminding yourself to strengthen up the hip, whether you're leaning towards your affected side or you're doing something similar to what Ralph said, where you're feeling those muscles in your hip to see which muscles are actually turning on or activating properly, then I think that by doing all of this together, it can really help your recovery and allow you to really go places when it comes to walking and recovering your ability to walk after your stroke.
Okay, I only got two real short, quick things to add. Then we'll wrap this up. And you mentioned policing. So when I put my hands on my hips and walked like that and tried to feel any muscle difference, and a lot of the hip dip went away, I couldn't come up with any real explanation for that other than the fact that I was concentrating on it or policing. Because if I took my hands off my hips, I guess I took my focus off of making sure that I was keeping them stable, and I would go right back. And then I could put my hands on my hips and it would halfway solve the problem again, take them off, and you're back to it. So the only thing I could think of was that my focus or my policing that leg, was why it worked, and that by putting my hands on my hips, that I was forcing my brain to focus on what my hips were doing. I also noticed that when I talked about my cousin going into that transverse abdominal thing, he put his hands right across those transverse abdominal muscles, took a few steps like that, and then removed them. I think what he was doing was concentrating his focus onto how to do that different type of walk, because he didn't have a stroke, he walks normally, so he doesn't walk around doing the transverse abdominal walk. Another thing you can do is, and I found this to be effective, I did it with myself and I did it with the stroke survivors I went to their homes and did physical therapy with. I used to call it out, whatever side they were. We'll just stick with left since both William and I are left affected. And, so we'd be doing counter exercises, and every time we go to the left, I go, push with that left. If we're doing heel raises or whatever, we're doing marching, raise that left, call them out loud. I would try and force them to focus on it. Also, William, we've talked about the more inputs, the more input, the more you're likely are to make a blueprint. So talking to yourself isn't a bad idea. So that's all I've got. So I guess unless you got anything else, we'll put all the videos we talked about in the description. And you have anything else, William, or should we sign off? And
Oh no, nothing else to add, Ralph. I guess for all the folks who are watching this, really really take to heart everything that Ralph and I have shared here. This is based off experience, personal experience that of our own stroke recovery and practical advice based on what we've noticed, which actually works in recovery after stroke, through a ton of trial and error, whether this be by ourselves or just seeing other stroke survivors and coaching them through the process as well.
Okay, well, the only thing I got to add is the earlier that you realize that you need hip strength and that you start working on the hip is the better. Like anything in stroke recovery, the earlier you can jump on it, the better. And the reason is, like, I wonder if all of what I did, not knowing some of the things that I know now, contributed to the issues that I have. Anytime that you develop bad habits, you and I've talked about this before, William. It's hard. It's hard to break bad habits. So the sooner you can jump on your hip and start working on, realize that you need good hip strength and work on it, then the less likely you are to end up with like hip dip and things that are bad habits that it then takes you a lot of effort to overcome. So jump on it. And thank you, William. And we'll see everybody next week or next time on Roadmap. Thanks for tuning in.
Great, thanks, Ralph.